Well, last week, as we began exploring the book of Esther, we went through the first 12 verses, and we were introduced to the Persian court. King Ahasuerus, the most powerful man on the planet at the time. We're about 500 years before the time of Christ, and he has gathered political officials from all over the empire to the capital city of Susa, which is in Iran, modern Iran. Apparently, he is trying to raise an army, large army, to fight the Greeks. And this long conference culminates with a 7-day feast. And then on the last day of that feast, an intoxicated Ahasuerus orders his queen, Vashti, to come and entertain the men with her beauty. This entertainment is not supposed to be wholesome. However, verse 12, Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. That's where we left it last week. Okay, crisis again in the palace, which brings us to our text today. We're going to be looking at verses 13 through 22, Esther chapter 1, 13 through 22. Really, the entire first chapter. We're still in the introduction to the book, which what's being explained is how this young Jewish girl, Esther, becomes the queen of Persia. This is all part of an introduction. Excuse me, yet even in this part of the story, the Lord has important things to say to us, and so that's what we want to focus upon today. And let's just pause and pray we would hear and heed what God has to say to each one of us. Thank you, Father, for your word, the Bible, the truth found, again, on every page, in every paragraph, every sentence. And we ask that we would hear these words today and that we would understand them and realize what they mean for our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, in recent years, this first chapter of Esther has received a great deal of attention from so-called feminist biblical scholars, because to them, Vashti has become kind of a cult hero or heroine, I guess. And they say the lesson is when a man, when your husband acts like a pig and treats you as nothing more than a sex object, the right thing to do is be like Vashti. Just say no. Refuse his demands. Stand up for yourself. Only do what you want to do, and God will be pleased with that. In more traditional circles, the response is, excuse me, no, the king was wrong. There's no excuse for his drunken behavior. But that doesn't justify Vashti's rebellion. Family and society depend on the God-ordained pattern where the husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church. And they say, Memacum, the advisor, is giving a very practical warning. If women start following Vashti's model and think there's no need to submit to their husbands, things will just fall apart. Well, I don't think either of those interpretations are what the writer of Esther, or the God who inspired the writer of Esther, was concerned about. If you want to know my views on the topic of husbands and wives, I preached a sermon on Ephesians 5 just a few months ago, and you can find that on the website. My point is that if that's where you get stuck in, trying to figure out the relationship between the king and the queen of Persia, you're going to miss the truth the Lord has for us in this passage. So let's not get stuck there. let's go and figure out what is God saying through this passage. Okay, so we have to look at the text. As we saw in verse 12, the King Ahasuerus, is furious at Queen Vashti. And so he turns to his cabinet, his counselors. Verse 14, the men next to him being, and I'm not going to even try to pronounce their names, but they're the 7 princes of Persia and Media who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom. Verse 13 notes that they are wise men. And apparently that means they're astrologers. That's what the Persians considered wise men. How much wisdom they actually possess is, as we will see, somewhat questionable. But these are the men the king relies on for advice. And so he asks them, verse 15, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti? Because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. And again, those were the 7 eunuchs. They had been given the assignment, bring the queen to the king. The response to the king's question, what do we do with the queen, comes from the advisor named Memucan. Now, we don't know, is he the leader of the cabinet or is he just the most outspoken? But anyway, this is what he says. I'm going to read 16 through 20. Not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. Excuse me. If it please the king, let the royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another, who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. Now, again, when we read this passage, a lot of things might come to your mind as you continue to evaluate, well, was the king wrong? Was the queen wrong? But I see something different here. In these words from the advisor Memucan, I see a total overreaction to what just happened. I think the queen's refusal to answer her drunken husband's summons could have probably been kept as a relatively private palace affair. And when he sobered up, the king could have even apologized to the queen, who would then likely have responded with her own apology, and they would have been back to being one happy royal couple, living happily ever after. Yet, I want you to listen again to the counsel of Memucan, the wise man advisor. I'm going to read it from the New Living this time. Verse 16, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also every noble and citizen throughout the empire. Everyone. Women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. Before this day is out, in the next 24 hours, the wives of all the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what the queen did and will start treating their husbands the same way. There will be no end to their contempt and anger. He then adds, if only the king will remove Vashti as queen and let everyone know that has happened, then, verse 20, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive proper respect from their wives. That's his advice. Now remember, there is no reason to believe that news of what had occurred, that the queen refused the king's order. Who knew about that? Well, unless the king chooses to tell people, basically the 7 eunuchs assigned the task of bringing her. Probably no women, other than maybe a handful of servants, knew anything about that. And certainly news was not going to spread to the far corners of the Persian Empire within the next 24 hours. In fact, there is no women's liberation movement going on in ancient Persia. I would suggest that Memucan, what he says, is a huge overreaction to the event that occurred. Now, I don't know. Is he panicked? Is he genuinely panicked? Is he that paranoid that he really thinks this is what is going to happen? Or might he be trying to engage in some political manipulation by getting others to panic? I think the fact is his fear and suspicions, the scenarios he imagines, are ridiculous. The entire fabric of the Persian Empire is not likely to be ripped apart because of the refusal of one woman to not heed one of the king's summons. That's simply a rather naive view of reality if he actually thinks that's what will occur. And yet, King Ahasuerus, though a very powerful man, is probably not the sharpest pencil in the box, as we would say. And even though he's apparently now sober, he says, or it says, verse 21, this advice pleased the king and the princes. And the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in his own script, and to every people in his own language, that every man be master of his own household and speak according to the language of his people. Now everything will be wonderful in Persia again. Okay, we're just going to stop there. And remember, this is all an introduction that will explain how Esther becomes queen. But already I see 2 main points that the writer of Esther, the God-inspired writer, is making in this passage. Point number 1. Powerful people, though they may be very impressive in some ways, powerful people can be very foolish. You know, one of the big themes of the Old Testament is that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Knowledge of the holy is understanding. The court of the pagan Persian ruler, King Ahasuerus, though possessing immense political power, is really made up of foolish men who do not fear and trust the Lord. This ridiculous panic over Queen Vashti's refusal to heed the drunken king's summons illustrates that. 1 Kings 18, Elijah mocks the prophets of Baal. He talks about how foolish they are for following a false god. And I think in this passage, the writer is more subtly, but just as assuredly, mocking the Persian court for their foolish panic. Panic which is characteristic of people who do not know the Lord. See, those who do not fear God often fear many other things, things of which those who fear the Lord have no reason to be afraid. I think another way this chapter subtly mocks the Persian court is when the writer records Memucan's words in verse 19. Let a royal order go out from the king, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed. Now we see the same thing in the book of Daniel. The Persians, the Medo-Persian emperors write their words, and it is in stone. Nothing can change that. Really? The persons tried to pretend their laws were somehow permanent. These laws could never be changed, that they might even be eternal. And yet every faithful Jew back then and every faithful Jew today should laugh at such a thought. Because it is only the law of God that cannot change. Only the law of God is not susceptible to human whims and inconsistencies. How foolish it is to trust in the laws of the Persians and Medes rather than in the law of the Lord. The court of King Ahasuerus consisted of, yes, the most powerful men on the planet. Yet because they did not trust, know, or serve God, they are best described as fools. Powerful people, though they might be impressive in many ways, can be very foolish. Second point I see in the text is that amidst all these human flaws, frailty, and foolishness, God accomplishes his purpose. Through it all, God accomplishes his purpose. The decree that Memucan recommends is, verse 19 again, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. Let someone else be queen. Okay, spoiler alert for those of you who haven't read the book of Esther yet. Who's going to become the queen? Esther. Vashti won't be the queen. Esther will be the queen. She'll take her place. And because she is in that role, Esther will then be able to accomplish the purpose that God has in this book, saving his people, saving the Jews. Now, when Memucan gives the king this advice, he doesn't have a clue what God's purpose is. When the king issues the edict, he has no idea what God's purpose is. But that does not stop the Lord from using their choices to accomplish his will. That's again what we call divine providence. God is working through choices we as human beings freely make to accomplish his purpose, even if the people making the choices are completely unaware of the purpose. Sometimes we call these remarkable coincidences. And there have been a few of them throughout history. One that always amazes me, do you all know this? On July 4th, 1826, 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, what happened? I don't have chocolate to give you. What happened that day? Dave Arndt isn't here. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both died the same day, 50 years after they signed the 50 years to the date after they signed the Declaration of Independence. They both died. A remarkable coincidence. Or one had forgotten about this one. So just within a year after a man named Edward Booth saved the life of Robert Lincoln, within a year, Edward Booth's brother, John Wilkes Booth, would kill Robert Lincoln's father, Abraham Lincoln. Apparently unconnected, but rather remarkable coincidence. Well, the book of Esther is a series of remarkable coincidences. And one thing to do as we go through the book is to note the number of times where it just so happens that an event occurs that then ends up playing a key role in the story. The first one might be the king getting drunk. What if the king would have stayed sober? What if he would have never called Vashti? What if she would have never refused his command? Well, then Esther would have never become the queen. The book of Esther really does involve a series of remarkable providences. God is at work. God is at work through all these little details. We mentioned this last week, this chain. There's significant events, but they're always held together by this chain of seemingly insignificant details through which God accomplishes his plan. Okay, those are the 2 points, the main points I see from our text, and that leads us to 2 lessons for us to apply. Lesson number 1, don't be foolish. Don't overreact to different situations. Don't panic. Don't follow the example of the king's advisors and turn one little event to a kingdom-wide crisis, which was a worldwide crisis. Now, right now, overreaction kind of seems to be the norm, especially within the political realm. And that's a whole other topic. But I would say we have a lot of overreaction in a lot of aspects of life right now. Sometimes it happens in the home. Parents sometimes overreact to something their child does. So, for example, 11-year-old Joey steals a candy bar from the local convenience store. And mom decides Joey is destined for a life of crime, and he'll be sentenced for 30 years in the federal prison by the time he's 18, unless she grounds him for the next 9 months. Maybe a little bit of an overreaction. Now, again, stealing a candy bar is not inconsequential. And a good parent will make sure Joey realizes, son, you did something wrong, and make sure he experiences some form of punishment and learns from that mistake. But it's very easy to overreact. Because parents need to remember that children and teens, they're going to do wrong things sometimes. That's what kids do. Sometimes they'll do it because they lack maturity and good judgment, or sometimes they'll do wrong things just because they're sinners, like their parents are, and everyone else on the planet. Parents should also work on avoiding overreactions when relating to adult children. You know, it's amusing, as the progressive commercials remind us, how much like their parents many young adults are. There's a lot of imitation going on out there. But there are times when a son or daughter makes a different choice than his parents would like. As an adult, makes a different choice. For example, you might have a son or daughter who voted for a different candidate than you did in the last election. Or your son or daughter is going to a different kind of church than you do. Or maybe they're even cheering for a different football team than you are. It's important not to overreact when those things happen. Maintaining a positive relationship despite differences needs to be a priority. Now, there are reasons to be concerned. Sometimes if your adult child, for example, son or daughter stops attending church or starts expressing doubts about the Bible or about Christianity, maybe even about the existence of God, a parent ought to be concerned. But overreaction is not the answer. Remember, doubts don't equal unbelief. Questions and conversation are almost always a better response than shock and outrage. And in these relationships, and really any relationships that we have with others, it's important to exhibit patience and follow the instructions the Lord gives us in James 1:19. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. That's true within the home. It's true within the church. Some folks overreact whenever there are any doctrinal differences within a congregation. And yes, it's so important that pastors and congregations be committed to sound doctrine, sound teaching, and that we be diligent in rejecting false teaching that denies biblical truth. But we need to be careful not to overreact. When someone doesn't dot their theological I's or cross their theological T's in the exact same we do, we don't need to overreact. For example, there are some churches, Baptist churches, that do not recognize a baptism unless it is done in a stream, in flowing water. Baptism at a lake like we're going to do this afternoon, that's not good enough because Jesus was baptized in the River Jordan, not the Sea of Galilee, the River Jordan. Folks, that's majoring on a minor. And don't forget, the only thing the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8 cared about was that the water was wet. I think it was a big mud puddle that he got baptized in. We especially need to be careful not to overreact when other Christians make different decisions than we do about, I call them gray matters, issues where the Bible doesn't clearly speak, so there really is no black and white. Romans 14, the Apostle Paul gives us really good instructions about how do you deal with those situations. He says, well, you allow the other person to follow his or her conscience, and you don't condemn or judge that individual. Because, yeah, you can talk about, you can have discussions with that person. You can explain why you think he or she is not making a good decision. But if it's an issue on which the Bible doesn't speak or doesn't speak clearly, that person should be following his or her conscience, not yours. They have to follow what they believe is right. They shouldn't be doing what you think is right. So don't overreact when Christian brothers or sisters have different opinions than you do. Do not overreact. That's wise counsel in any situation. The second lesson for us from our text is trust God. Trust God to work out his purposes in your life. Now, this is not a call to complacency. It is extremely unlikely that it is the Lord's will for your life just to sit around and let things happen. But even as we're active, even as we're involved in doing all sorts of things, he wants us to trust him. So whenever you find yourself in a seemingly random situation or in circumstances which are just beyond your control, which you're not excited about, view that situation not just as an irritation, but view it as an opportunity from the Lord, an opportunity to honor him and serve other people. For example, some of you, I know, have experienced frustration because of delayed or canceled airline flights when you've been traveling. And that's frustrating. Your plane was supposed to take off at 9 in the morning, and you can't go till 3 o'clock now. You got 6 hours in the airport with nothing to do. That is frustrating. But really, I think the first question that you might want to ask yourself is, okay, when did God know that my flight was going to be canceled today? When did God figure that out? Well, if you answer anything less than 1 billion years ago, you're wrong, okay? We'll stick with 1 billion years. He actually always knew it. God always knew your flight was going to be canceled. So then, why didn't he do something about it? Why didn't he at least warn me so I could have booked a flight with another airline last week? Well, the answer is maybe because he wants you to do something during this next 6 hours you're stuck in the airport waiting for the next flight. Maybe there is something you should be doing during this next 6 hours. Something besides grumble and complain, that is. Maybe there's someone in the airport with whom you should be having a conversation. Or maybe there is someone on the next flight with whom you're supposed to have a talk with that wouldn't have been sitting by you on the 9 o'clock flight. You've got 6 hours, you've got your cell phone with you. Maybe there are some phone calls you should be making to people you haven't talked to for quite some time, maybe. Or maybe there's that book in your bag that you've been meaning to read for weeks, but haven't had time. And now you can sit down and you can actually take time to read that. Now, these may not seem to be significant opportunities, But again, remember, we talked about a couple of weeks ago, remember that the ripple effects of even small choices that we make can be huge. You may not never, if you end up talking to some gal in the coffee shop, you may never know the impact that conversation is going to have. When you make a small choice, it's God, not you, who knows the impact of what that decision will be. I suspect every one of us, even right now, has some circumstance in our life which we wish was different. Something in life right now that I wish it was different. Maybe you're single and you would like to be married. Or maybe you're married and would like to be single, but that's not good at all. Or maybe you wish you had a different job. I wish I was I wish I was going to a different job tomorrow. Or I wish I could retire right now. I wish I didn't have to work. Or I wish we lived in a different house. I'm so tired of this house. Or you're heading to college in the fall and you wish you were going to a different school, but this is the one you've applied for, this is the one that accepted you. Or I wish I were cheering for a different football team. Actually, you can change that right now. That's a bad one. The point is simply, whatever your circumstance, whatever situation, whatever time and place you happen to be, the Lord, in His providence, is giving you right now, today, this afternoon, He's giving you an opportunity to do His will. He's giving you an opportunity to respond to the situation in which you are in a way that pleases Him. And if you can't figure out, well, I don't know what that could possibly be, let's chat. I'll try to point out how you might honor the Lord in the specific situation in which you are. A lot of times, sometimes, yes, changing the situation is the answer, but a lot of times that's not really possible. This is a situation in which you are. And the question is, Lord, how can I honor you? How can I please you right now, today? Ask yourself that question. Find that answer, and then, by God's grace, may He help you to do that for His glory.